will go ahead and introduce our speaker today and kind of talk about what we'll be covering, as well as how this fits into our speaker series. My name is Cassie Clark, and I am a public historian for the Women's History Initiative for the Utah Division of State History. And Dr. Sasha Coles is with us today in honor to talk about silk production in Utah, more specifically women's participation in silk production and basically women's pioneering of it, right? And how they are leading the way in the silk production in honor of Women's History Month. The Utah Historical Society's 125th speaker series is in commemoration of the 125th anniversary of the founding of the Utah State Historical Society. And this month, as I said before, is in reference to Women's History Month in particular. Today we have Dr. Sasha Coles. She is presenting on her research, which is about silk production in Utah. She's a historian of the 19th century United States with interest in women and gender, religion, and capitalism in the American West. She received her training at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and briefly taught at the University of Utah before joining Penn State as an assistant teaching professor in August of 2021. Her first book focuses on the women workers who fueled the silk industry in Western Latter-day Saint or Mormon settlements from the 1850s to the 1910s. This research has received support from the Charles Rudd Center for Western Studies, the Coalition for Western Women's History, the Mormon History Association, the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah, and the Huntington Library. So thank you for joining us here today, Sasha. And if you have questions, you feel free to use the question and answer for the audience. Fill the question and answer link at the bottom or share it in the chat. And also, the recording will be uploaded. We are recording this session. We will upload it to our YouTube account so you can watch it later. So I'll turn the time over to Sasha, and I'm excited to hear what you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie. And I'm being recorded. I feel like a celebrity. This is wonderful. Seeing all the attendees roll in, it's really great because I see a lot of folks who actually helped me quite a bit with this research, with this project. And I'm enjoying that so much. And I just want to thank Cassie and Jed and the folks at the Utah State Historical Society for inviting me. It's really an honor to be able to present my work. I've used the Utah State Historical Society's records plenty of times in my research. And so I'm just delighted to be able to pay it forward, so to speak. So what I'd like to do now is share some of my screen, and we're going to go to presenter view. All right, folks. Cassie, would you just confirm that you can actually see something?
I can. That looks good.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. All right. So folks, good afternoon. And it's really nice to be here with you. And again, Cassie, thanks for that very nice introduction. And of course, happy Women's History Month. We love that. So what I'd like to do today is start with this black silk dress, which might actually look familiar to some of you. This black dress belonged to the famous abolitionist and women's rights advocate, Susan B. Anthony. It currently lives at the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House in Rochester, New York. And until very recently, actually, a life-size cutout of this dress was on display in Salt Lake City's Church History Museum. This dress cutout was part of a fabulous exhibit that I had the opportunity to see titled Sisters for Suffrage. It opened in November of 2019, and according to promotional materials, the exhibit was celebrating the pioneering role of Latter-day Saint women in local and national suffrage activism. Now, Susan B. Anthony, she vehemently opposed the church's practice of plural marriage, but she was a major celebrant of the passage of Utah Territory's equal suffrage law in 1870, and she forged many meaningful alliances with Latter-day Saint women suffragists. The black silk dress was used in the Church History Museum, I think, to really capture the friendships and ideological ties that bound Anthony and Mormon women together. In 1900, actually, the year Anthony turned 80, the board members of the Utah Silk Commission gifted Anthony with the dress's fabric, which had been raised and reeled and woven in the state, according to reports. Now, all of the Utah Silk Commission's board members were women, and most were practicing Latter-day Saints. And according to this account, in the Improvement era, Anthony's letter of acknowledgement for the gift stated, quote, "The fact that the mulberry tree grew in Utah, in a state where women are politically equal with men, greatly enhances its value." I think the Anthony dress is just one powerful snapshot of Mormon women's political activism in the 19th century, but I would also describe it as maybe the biggest success story to come out of a decades-long attempt to manufacture silk in the American West. And that's really the subject of my book In Progress, which is in essence about silk in 19th century Utah territory. So after Latter-day Saints began to colonize the homeland of Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples that in the 1840s was claimed by Mexico, one of their top priorities was the establishment of a self-sufficient economy that would involve various home industries, and perhaps folks are already familiar with that term. So that would include things like sugar beets, iron, cotton, and wool. And the point here is to provide resources and employment in growing settlements, to prevent reliance on expensive imported goods, and also to ensure a level of cultural and economic and political independence from non-Mormon influence. And in this respect, we see Latter-day Saints attempting to create an economy that is really by and for Mormons. And silk, I would argue, is an instrumental part of this initiative. And the silk industry, men certainly did make important investments in this enterprise during its entire existence from the 1850s to the early 1900s. But it's really women who are at the core of the silk story. And as historians of ancient China and early modern Europe and colonial America and other times and places in world history would show us, women have really always been at the core of silk's labor force. So it's actually no surprise then that Mormon women, sometimes with the help of their children, were the ones attempting to plant trees, raise worms, and produce cocoons, thread, and cloth of a high enough quality to use and sell. Now, these workers are never able to capture a very large market share or compete with high quality goods from abroad. But I would say that even in this failure, there's a lot that we can learn. So I'd like to share with you all some of my research questions, and this project is really shaped by these following questions. So first, what attracts Latter-day Saints to silk? I mean, what are the problems that they hope the industry will solve in the 19th century American West? Why did Mormon women persist with this experiment for so long, even after repeatedly failing to turn a profit or fully replace imported goods from Europe and Asia? What are the symbolic meanings that Latter-day Saints have assigned to the silk industry's raw materials and finished products? And that's that real rich cultural history that I enjoy so much. And then the last question actually relates to, I think, my much larger research agenda or general interest as a historian, which is how have activities in the marketplace shaped the contours of Mormon identity? Now, I want to share a few key findings, and then I'll go into more detail about the people and places that I've encountered in my research. So I like to think that this book will make a few contributions. The first is that historians have long talked about Mormon economic life in the 19th century as pretty unique and distinct and exceptional. And there are very wonderful landmark studies by Leonard J. Arrington and Dean L. May and others who've shown us that Mormons were invested in creating an economy that was really worthy of Christ's second coming. And so I think for this reason, as they've shown us, the spiritual and the temporal spheres are really intertwined in Latter-day Saint society. And so that is part of the reason why church leaders are intervening directly into economic affairs, and also, as these historians have described, why everyday Latter-day Saints are really invested in cooperation and isolation and environmental stewardship. And Jed knows a little bit of, he knows a lot actually about that particular element of Latter-day Saint belief and practice. But I think that the silk industry operations, what they do is expose a little bit more diversity in Mormon economic decision-making. So I see Latter-day Saints embracing vigorous extraction of natural resources. I see them fostering business relationships with entrepreneurs outside of Utah territory. They are attempting to intervene into global markets, and they are making many shall we say, risky and profit-minded moves. And in this respect, I am joining a chorus of more recent scholarship that shows how Latter-day Saints in the 19th century are really synthesizing cooperation and centralized planning with the ideas and infrastructure that are motivating capitalism. And I think by acknowledging that, we actually get a view of a religious institution that is much more responsive to the forces of industrialization. I think David Walker's book, Railroading Religion, is a really great example of this. David Walker was also on my dissertation committee, so I think his influence is being very powerfully felt here. But what I think is not as well understood is how women are the ones who are synthesizing these ideals and infrastructure. Now, there's some exceptions to this, but in general, the big studies of the Mormon economy really are about men. So they're about male church presidents, they're about bishops, they're about male business owners, and they're about male household heads. But I like to clarify in this book how gendered ideas about work and women's work in and out of the home played a pivotal role in shaping Mormon economic life. And there's a lot of great resources out there that can help us get at these questions. So things like Relief Society meeting minutes, individual letters, account books, diaries, family histories, photographs, material culture samples, all of these sources that Mormon women left behind, they show us how silk is getting inserted into the many other activities Mormon women are performing, raising children, managing crops and livestock, running businesses, and also attending many religious meetings. But I think also by talking about silk, these women are really articulating their own place in the local, national, and global economies. So when they're talking about silk, they're talking about the economy more generally. And from these conversations, I do see Mormon women really creating a productive space where cooperation and isolation and Mormon exceptionalism can sort of coexist with competition, market integration, and American citizenship. And by taking women's actions and words really at the center of this project, I am building on a long tradition of scholarship from Mormon women themselves. So historians like Jill Mulvey-Durr and Maureen Ursenbach Beecher, and perhaps most famously, Laurel Ulrich, have helped us move beyond the stereotype of the cloistered and oppressed Mormon woman who, I mean, in reality, these women were central to the church's formation and territorial expansion, also to the fight against anti-polygamy legislation, as well as the suffrage movement of the late 19th century. But what I think silk allows us to get at is the interplay between Mormon women's working lives, market entanglements, and political engagement. So I see all these things working together. All right, so how about some more nitty-gritty silk history, shall we? I think before we can get at all of that stuff, we want to explore the roots of American silk more closely. So by the time that Mormons in the Great Basin are turning their attention to silk, there had been a combination of free and unfree labor fueling silk industries on the North American continent for centuries. So that includes Cortez's experiment with silk after the conquest of the Aztec Confederacy. We also see silk gaining a foothold in British and French North American colonies. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, we have European monarchs and administrators really interested in generating raw material for Europe's expanding manufacturing centers. And so we see colonial assemblies requiring landholders to dedicate a portion of their property to the mulberry tree, for example, and also funding cocoon bounties. Farmers and planters maybe initially respond enthusiastically and like the idea of agricultural diversification. They also argue that silk work can transform supposed liabilities, namely women, Native people, enslaved people, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities into assets. So said another way, people supposedly too young, too old, too weak, or not skilled enough for other kinds of work could generate capital by collecting mulberry trees, raising silkworms, and reeling thread. So actually, we see workers undertaking silk in every colony except Maryland. And there's a ton of challenges that come with this. In general, these settlers generally decide to dedicate their time and capital toward different cash crops that are more reliable. And as on-the-ground interest wanes, we see government support mostly drying up. Now, Latter-day Saints in the American West don't seem too concerned about this history of downward trajectories. The boosterism of Latter-day Saint leaders really paralleled that of interested parties who had come before them, and that they emphasized the supposedly idle hands of household, quote, dependents, and that included in the 19th century women and children, as well as the elderly, poor people, and people with disabilities. I think George A. Smith is helpful to help us understand this. So he says in the 1860s, quote, millions of dollars worth of silk might thus be annually produced in this territory from labor that now counts for very little. The feeble, the aged, the lame, and almost any person, no matter how weakly, might be employed at this business. Now, I want to linger on this for a moment. These concerns are very sort of 19th century. And what I mean by that is there isn't necessarily an actual decline in women's domestic tasks that silk is offering to resolve. Instead, what we're seeing is the relevance of like the shifting shape and significance of household work in the decades leading up to the American Civil War, which I think can help explain this. So in this period, we see wages and cash exchanges becoming more central to an industrializing economy. And as a result, the sewing and cooking and cleaning and child rearing that women undertook did not directly engage with this cash nexus. And as a result of this, the perceived value of that labor starts to evaporate. So we actually see in the US context, the word labor starting to apply exclusively to male wage earning, and the economy starts to refer specifically to activities outside of the domestic sphere. We also see at this time a wave of young women moving away from the farm and away from their parents' supervision into the textile mills to accept wage work. And for some 19th century Americans, the mulberry tree and the silkworm are offering solutions to this sense of eroding parental authority and also this illusion of decreased productivity. So in this respect, actually, male household heads were the ones who stood to gain from domestic silk production because the industry could bring new sources of capital under their control and also at some level reinstate their authority over their wives and children. But a homegrown silk industry would not come easily. And if folks are familiar with this topic, they've probably heard this before, but maybe not these details exactly, which I would certainly hope, because why buy my book otherwise, right? So at the very outset, local producers in Utah Territory, they're having trouble securing enough mulberry trees. So the leaves of the white mulberry, the Morus alba, they have long been recognized as the silkworm's food of choice. And the Chinese made this discovery 4,700 years ago. And since then, wherever silk production has gone, the white mulberry tree has followed. So it gets to North America in the 16th century with the Spanish, and then it appears in Virginia in the 17th century, and then Pennsylvania, Georgia, and the Carolinas after that. And we see Latter-day Saints bringing the tree or the seeds, at least, to Utah Territory in the mid-19th century. And mulberry trees are pretty hardy, and I know that there are still some lingering mulberry trees from the 19th century moment throughout certain areas of Salt Lake City and St. George and in other places as well. But Mormon settlers, they do realize that mulberry trees are not invincible. So when Lydia McClellan, for example, tries her hand at tree cultivation in St. George in the 1870s, she tells an assembly at Relief Society meeting that her plants, quote, looked well for a season and then looked yellow as though it was too hot for them or the soil not right. So we can look at this, and based on what we know about mulberry trees, it's likely that McClellan was dealing with very young mulberry trees, and very young mulberry trees are pretty sensitive, and they probably needed more water than they got. And in other moments in time, things like drought and frost and flood make it difficult for Latter-day Saints to secure a large enough and consistent enough silkworm food supply. Working with silkworms, no picnic either. Many factors like class status and family networks and disability actually shaped the way that Latter-day Saints experienced the silk experiment. But amid this diversity, generally we see women and children handling the sort of mundane and labor-intensive tasks that are necessary to make silk function. Now, when you think of silk, you probably think of luxury, at least I would guess. And that was true in the 19th century as well. So we have in Utah Territory, newspapers describing elegant silk lanterns from China, and also Middle Eastern women wearing glossy silk trousers. But for the women who actually raised silkworms in Latter-day Saint settlements, silk was more associated with sort of practical affairs and also unpleasantness. So I'm showing you right now this print from 19th century Japan, which I think illustrates, one, that women are often motivating silk, but also it's sort of an intimate affair. And for a lot of people, especially those who didn't have enough property or money to establish a cocoonery, for example, they are raising their silkworms at home. And in diaries and letters, women are talking about silkworms as very noisy. So they describe their incessant eating as sounding like rain upon the trees, which certainly would keep me up at night. And in other ways too, the silk industry sort of tethers women more closely to the home. And I have one example of that. So this is, I think, a pretty famous anecdote. When Priscilla Jacobs, she is trying to time silkworm hatching with mulberry tree maturation. And that can be a kind of a tricky thing to succeed at. And so what she does, and this is something that women in Japan and China had been doing for a long time, is she puts a package of silkworm eggs actually against her chest to heat them up to prompt them to hatch. But according to Jacobs, the eggs actually hatch during a church service. So she finds herself wanting to leave the assembly and get her silkworms back home. There are other examples of this, and I think this was a pretty challenging reality to be confronted with, that silk work was not easy or simple or automatic. And that is especially true considering how church leaders are often making grand promises about how silk is going to be automatically profitable and also even pleasant. But that just wasn't the case. So the industry really demanded time and skill and energy and capital that many women just didn't have access to. But I think the fact that they're able to sustain it, at least on a small scale for such a long time, is really testament to how they're able to make this industry work for them and sort of achieve the goals that they are invested in. So I think the Transcontinental Railroad is a great illustration of this. And folks who are local to Utah are likely aware that in 1869, we have the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad not too far from Salt Lake City in Ogden. And this unification really catalyzes a surge in silk in Western Mormon communities. And that is advanced by women's organizations like Relief Society and Retrenchment, which is known as Young Women's now. And this is for two reasons. So one, the railroad provokes serious debate about Mormon women's shopping habits. So we should be reminded, right, that the practice of plural marriage is a very present issue in American politics in the 19th century. So the Republican Party, their very first platform of 1852 promises to abolish Southern slavery and Mormon polygamy. We also know that the federal government denies Utah statehood applications and even engages or experiments with anti-polygamy legislation in the 1860s, and that's going to become increasingly more punitive in the 1870s and 1880s. Now, there's this interesting element to this situation, and that is the fact that trade is an important site of debate over plural marriage and Mormon sovereignty in the West. And I think a good illustration of that is how some congressmen argue that there's no need to send in the military or pass legislation to plural marriage. You just send in fancy clothes, okay? So Clarkson and Potter from New York, he states that the railroad and its cargoes of expensive goods would really do the job of eliminating plural marriage. So he states, quote, "Think, sir, of a man with 20 wives going out of a morning to buy silk dresses. Nothing could meet the cost of supporting their families in such a style, and it therefore seems to me as if these changes will have a certain and growing effect in breaking up this system so at variance with our race and time." Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but for sake of time, I want to give you another example. Newspaper coverage from the time really imbues the railroad with the power to inspire fits of shopping among Mormon women and bankrupt their families. So what you're seeing here on the screen is from the Washington Post in 1871. If you look closely, you'll see on the right side of the image, there is a bug-eyed husband who's being physically held hostage, actually strangled by 3 of his wives. Meanwhile, another wife, who appears to actually be significantly younger than the others, she relieves her husband of the money in his front pocket while eyeing the jewelry and fashions in the shop window behind her. Now, in the very background where you see the tabernacle and the temple, if you come a little bit closer, you'll see that there's another LDS family there. There's a patriarch at the head and a trail of wives following behind him. But one of his wives has actually broken away from the pack, and she's started running towards the shop windows so fast that her bonnet has even flown off her head. So in this situation, what we're talking about is really the role of women's impulses for fashion as seen as related to the tools of Mormonism's destruction. And I think we need to understand this political rhetoric to really understand Mormon women's attractions to silk production. So it really falls on their shoulders in a big way to ease the tensions created by this commercial contact with the outside world. And we see Mormon women in the 1860s and 70s trying to direct their purchasing power towards church-friendly establishments and also producing homemade goods. I mean, more related to silk in particular. So during church assemblies, they're sharing silkworms with one another. They're talking about how to keep these darn things alive long enough. They're also planning to import reels and weaving machinery. And they're encouraging each other as mothers to enlist the help of their sons and daughters. So for Mormon women, silk isn't just about making money. It's about asserting their humanity, even when critics are often also insisting that plural marriage transformed women into drudges and deprived them of the good things in life. Silk serves yet another purpose for women at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. So this takes place during and is sort of seen as advancing this process of Mormonism's Americanization. So Mormon Americanization at the turn of the century involved abandoning or maybe downplaying some of the most controversial activities associated with the church. So Wilford Woodruff, the church president at the time, he removes official sanction for the practice of plural marriage. Other things happen as well, but more generally, scholars have shown how this process didn't always bode very well for women in particular. So at the most basic level, marriages lost legitimacy in the eyes of the state, right? And also church leaders begin to assume more control over formally autonomous women's organizations. But I think there's another part to this story that shows how women can use the market essentially to preserve and accumulate authority. And the fair is one good example. So the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 happens on the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's, quote, discovery of the New World. And this epic international event invites visitors to the White City, which is pictured here, to essentially bear witness to the triumphs of industrial America and also the supposed, quote, primitiveness of non-Western societies. So we see this tremendous papering over of racial antagonisms and class conflict with exhibits of really robust manufacturing capacity and rapid scientific advancement. But there's something specific that Latter-day Saints have to gain at the fair. And I think this is captured well in one newspaper article from the Millennial Star, which says that long-rooted prejudices will have been torn up by the close of the fair, and the labors, toils, and sufferings of Latter-day Saints in assisting in the development of the grandest nation on earth will be appreciated. So women are really instrumental to broadcasting this more modern version of Mormonism. And in essence, homemade silk appears in this venue as a signal of Utah territory in sync with industrial development. So for the Utah building, pictured here, representatives from Utah collected silk scarves, handkerchiefs, thread, and upholstered furniture and sent them to Chicago. Visitors to the Utah building could take in those remnants, but also those of Utah Territory's, quote, savage people. So pottery and arrowheads work in tandem in the Utah building to really feature the productivity of, in particular, white Latter-day Saints and the success they have in enveloping the American West into the nation. Fair attendees could also find silk in the women's building. So the women's building at the fair was the responsibility of the Board of Lady Managers, which was created in the 1890s to handle all things woman-related for the event. And the president of the Board of Lady Managers was Bertha Palmer, who was a Chicago-based philanthropist. And she hears that there are going to be silk exhibits at the Utah building. And Palmer reaches out to women from Utah Territory and says, could you perhaps make a silk exhibit for the women's building as well? And her wishes were ultimately granted by a set of silk curtains. Now, at the event, there's really rich record of this. Latter-day Saints do continue to be seen as sort of odd specimens who are objects of curiosity and anthropological observation. So one fair visitor says, oh, attendees could see, quote, real live Mormon girls in person at the fair. But there's also this element here too, where Mormon women use silk to signify their support of the American economy. So in the words of Margaret A. Kane, who is instrumental to silk in the 1890s, she says, in America, Utah will be the home of the silkworm. So even in the 1890s, several decades after repeated challenges with the silk industry, Margaret Kane is still optimistic. Now, Kane's statement, I love this, came in physical form at the 1897 Pioneer Jubilee Parade in Salt Lake City, which really puts Kane's statement into practice in a larger than life way. So what you'll see on the screen is a float of two sun-bonneted women at the top, and there are figures of silkworms and mulberry tree leaves that make up the rest of the display. And this was just one element of essentially giving credit to Latter-day Saints for bringing productive enterprises to Utah, which had just been granted statehood not long before this, right? This is the parades in 1897. Utah achieved statehood in 1896. So here you're not going to get any sense of the riots or the murders or the ostracization that catalyzed LDS migration westward. You're also not going to get controversies over plural marriage. And you're also not going to get much of a history or acknowledgement of Native people in the region, right? History really begins with Mormon settlement in the 1840s, according to these commemorative activities. But what we see here actually is a way for Mormon women to describe something that had really been seen as marginal or like only for quote dependents. What they're doing is they're able to really build that out and say, no, look, our work in the domestic sphere with silk was really a way to install modernity on the quote unquote frontier. And so for them, you know, it becomes a history that's worth appreciating. So I'll just wrap up here by saying that silk has meant a lot throughout its decades-long history. And I think the Susan B. Anthony dress is one example of that. I think the displays from the 1890s are another. So at any moment, silk has been used to claim lots of different meanings, but also support a range of material aspirations. So I'll tell you, Mormon women, really depending on like the location, there has been everything from employment for children and quick individual profit to charity for the community and economic development for the state. I mean, all of those things would be on their minds at any one time. So we see Mormon women really trying to make all of these ideas work in concert. And sometimes that is tricky, right? Because these can be conflicting agendas. And that actually did create some struggle, in addition to the fact that mulberry trees didn't always survive and neither did silkworms. I mean, there's this one great example of someone's silkworms being eaten by their cat. So obviously the cat did not appreciate their presence in the home. But there's also challenges getting machinery and convincing politicians that silk is something worth investing in. And we see disappointment and frustration and a lot of pain even resulting from these repeated challenges. But I think still silk work and goods is this way for Mormon women to manage cooperation and competition, isolation and integration, and also religious exceptionalism and American belonging. So I think here we can better see the economic terrain on which Mormon identity took shape. And I am tired of talking. I'm sure y'all are tired of listening to me, but no. Thank you so much for hearing my little presentation here, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Sasha. That was absolutely awesome. I have more questions than I thought I would, only because I'm way more fascinated too. It looks like we have quite a bit of questions coming from the audience. I'm going to just start with a quick question, and then I'll explore what people are asking. One is, I mean, it's an obvious question that you've already addressed, but I'll kind of draw it out a little bit to make it more specific. But I keep thinking like, why silk? But I understand it's domestic, like it's like why silk? Like why not wool or something? You know, like, and I get it, but like, and so that kind of ignore that one. But I really like your statement about as silk is in sync with industrial development. But like, how does that fit into like middle to upper class 19th century middle to upper class white ideas about women's gender roles in society? Because like I would see that as in conflict of Mormon women's engagement in the industrial sector as being almost as if they're not participating in that gender roles, or like instilling or upholding the Victorian values that like larger progressives might be like hoping to accomplish or like trying to reinforce.
Right. Thank you, Cassie. Those are great questions. And I think why silk, and this interests me too, because it is unique from other commodities that especially Western historians are interested in, things like lumber and silver and copper. It's not capital intensive silk. I mean, it's designed to really be allowed to not take much capital investment, because the idea is you don't have to pay your wives and children a living wage the way that you would like a miner or something. So it's really designed to kind of pick up all the free hours that are supposedly made free by the move of textile production into factories. So there's this anxiety like, oh, if women aren't spinning and reeling and weaving anymore, we need to make sure that they stay busy. And also this is a way to sort of make money and also secure our other agricultural endeavors if something goes wrong, if the cotton market takes a nosedive or something. So I think the fact that it doesn't actually cost that much money to introduce silkworms into individual homes. And then if you get enough individual homes invested, then you just can collect cocoons and then invest in a sort of a relatively modest factory operation where you have reeling and weaving going on. Then maybe you make enough for women to wear their own homemade silk. But also maybe you just decide, I'm going to sell my silk cocoons to a pre-existing manufacturer. And that actually comes up in the 1870s and 80s when Latter-day Saints are realizing sort of, we are struggling so much to really reel silk thread of a high enough quality that can withstand the weaving process. And that's hard. It's very difficult. You need a lot of skill in order to do that. So there's a sense like we can make just some extra money for the household if we sell our cocoons elsewhere. So, and I love that there's controversy over this, right? Like not everyone agrees at which stage silk should be sold, at which stage of production. And I think that's a really interesting element that I haven't seen in the literature about Mormons and silk before.
Excellent. Great. Okay. So I'll start digging into some of the questions that are from our audience. The first one is multiple. I kind of think it's super relevant because I was thinking about this too. Where were the worms purchased from? How much did they cost? How long did worms live? And how much silk does one worm make?
These are all excellent questions that I have written about and details that I've since forgotten. I apologize for that. But what I can say is that often we see silkworm eggs being shared across individual households. So silkworm eggs, if you keep them cold, you can prevent them from hatching. And so if you keep them cold enough, you can very easily transport them long distances. And that's seen as very appealing, right? Because they're not very heavy and you can take them from one place to the other. And there is sort of this distribution network that develops because folks might be familiar that Brigham Young invests quite a bit in the silk industry and dedicates a lot of land and some funding to the enterprise. And so we see not only mulberry trees, but silkworm eggs being distributed from Forest Farm, which is, like basically an experimental agricultural station that Young develops. And he tests out a lot of different agricultural endeavors there with the help of his wives and children. So we have people donating them, we have people selling them. I know that Zina Young advertises in the paper like, I have silkworms and people can come get them. Prices are not always listed in the records, but they're not very expensive, I would say generally. And then how much silk can individual worms produce is essentially you need a lot of silkworms to get to the level of like the black fabric that they gift to Susan B. Anthony in the early 1900s. So I can get a precise number for you. It would just take a little digging.
Well, yeah, I think that's a good segue into like what I was considering about this entire topic too, is one, why and this goes along with the next question too. So I think it'll sum up together, like what happened, like because it seems to me, just listening to your presentation, is that more Mormon in general, and then Mormon women are like, you know what, we're going to produce silk, and there's almost like and please clarify, this is my question, is did they feel fairly confident they could pull it off and then get kind of in the middle of it and realize they didn't know what they were doing? Did they interact with, people from Japan or other places that produce silk and say, how do we do this? Or were they fairly confident and their ability to do so with very little like instruction or a manual or something? And then the question from the audience that goes along with it is, when did the Mormon organization give up the idea of investing in silk? And so I think both of those together kind of answers the overall.
Those are really excellent questions, as have all the questions so far. I really appreciate all of these. So there's a really impressive optimism that accompanies this particular silk experiment, but I would say all American silk experiments more generally. So there's all this language from colonial elites, but in this case, church leaders, both men and women, who say, silk is very easy. It won't be hard to incorporate into your day-to-day lives. And there is something true to that, in that silk requires very intense spurts of labor, but only for a relatively short amount of time. I mean, I think if you ask silk producers, they would beg to differ. I mean, they would say, 6 weeks is a long time, but that's essentially how long it takes for silkworms to grow large enough to spin their cocoons. And you're feeding them more and more mulberry tree leaves over time. And maybe that process, like at the outset, seems to be not very complicated, but silkworms are very finicky organisms. So we do see an investment from Latter-day Saints who are interested in silk. We do see them as early as the 1870s, sort of producing pamphlets and manuals to help people figure out how to do this exactly. Otherwise, information is being distributed maybe through the Deseret News. I mean, there's one particular sericulturist, his name is Louis Bertrand, and he will publish articles that say things like worms need this many leaves on this day, and then as they advance to this age, you need to feed them this often, things like that. But again, silkworms have a lot of enemies, right? They have not just the cat and the rat and the spider, but apparently also things like loud noises, but also dramatic drops in temperature. And we know that Utah Territory certainly was subject to that as well. So we see manuals in the 1870s. There's another one published in the 1890s by the Utah Silk Commission, which is the institution responsible for the Anthony dress in 1900. But the enterprise really cannot last without state funding. And that was true in the colonial period. So colonial assemblies are responsible for funding cocoon bounties, for example, and also incentivizing mulberry tree planting. The Utah State Legislature in 1896 establishes a 25-cent per pound cocoon bounty for locals. And that sort of, it kind of comes after the Chicago World's Fair, which brings attention to Utah-based silk production. And people who had been involved in the enterprise for a long time are able to take advantage of that, right? So it gives the industry this new energy. But the bounty only lasts for a few years. It's abolished in 1904, 1905. The legislature essentially decides not to extend it. The reason is they simply cannot compete with higher quality imports from Japan and China. They just simply cannot. And that industrial infrastructure for reeling, but even for, silkworm raising, there's something industrial about like a large cocoonery with multiple shelves where you can process lots of silkworms at once. That infrastructure had been in place for a long time by the time Latter-day Saints in Utah Territory are becoming interested.
Yeah, and I would just think that like overall, assuming that you can replicate something that other people have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is it kind of tells a story about American industrialization and looks into like the broader narrative of just like, hey, let's try out this silk thing, and then just call it a failure. Almost places the responsibility on the people who produced it, as opposed to recognizing that like it's not just something you can just like pick up, and like especially, and that was one thing that with what you mentioned about like soil quality, it does seem like they're shooting from the hip, of like how do we plant these trees, and like how do we keep these worms alive and like producing. I think my next question, and then there's a question that I'll conclude with about just like providing everybody with more information about your upcoming book. We'll conclude with that one. So if anybody has any other questions, please feel. Oh wait, there might be another question that I'm missing. Yeah. So let's do this one first. So when did the industry die in Utah? Like when was it? When had they completely given it up, and like why overall?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And one thing related to this larger book question has to do with some further research that I like to do, because I do have great records from a few relief societies, which Relief Society is really instrumental to the silk industry. There are also a few silk-centered organizations in Salt Lake City, also in Provo, that have meeting minutes that really give you some great insight into the dynamics of the industry. And in the case of Provo, they are established in, I want to say either the late 1870s or the very early 1880s. And the meetings are taking place pretty regularly, maybe once a month, maybe twice a month. And then you see this really significant drop off in the 1890s. And then sort of out of nowhere, there's an entry from 1906. It doesn't even have a month or a day, but it just says, we've decided to dissolve the organization because we can't compete with imports in China and Japan. So that's like a very clear articulation from that organization when people stop investing. But even in the 1890s, there are hints of this, because we have actually tree-centered, not demands, really asks from church leaders, saying things like Zina Young is saying, don't cut down your mulberry trees, people. You still need them. We still want them. And there's also an encouragement to plant more. And the mulberry tree is, I think, really instrumental to this story, right? There's just seems to be never enough mulberry trees spread out through communities that are interested in at least attempting silk. So really, it's in the early 1900s that there's not much mention of silk being produced any longer. It also has to do with mulberry trees being a big pain. I don't know if folks have fruiting mulberry trees in their neighborhoods, in their own yards, but when the mulberry trees that produce fruit can be quite messy and really contradict these city beautification campaigns we see in the 1910s, 1920s.
Great. So, what was I want one last question that I have. Oh wait, there's another question from the audience. I can ask you anytime. So, oh, they make great fruit and great jam. I'm gonna have to try at this stage.
I've never tried, but have seen some excellent looking recipes published in the local newspapers. So,
all right. Yeah, I think I really found the story fascinating about the woman with the trying to hatch her worms. What were some of the big complaints that you've seen in the literature about women like participating and like trying to grow this industry in Utah?
It's I would say the biggest one is just the impressive slate of jobs they already have on their plate. So in the St. George context, for example, women will talk about in the 1860s and 1870s, they'll talk about, we've just had a disease rip through, our children are sick, we're at home caring for them. We have been tasked with grain storage. We need to manage that situation. We're turning our attention there. And then there are maybe one or two voices that continually will pop up and say, don't forget the silk industry. Don't forget the silk industry. But I would say there are just bigger fish to fry. Okay, there are families to take care of. There are sacred temples to clean. There are the poor to take care of. But we also do see women trying to reconcile all these things, right? Like maybe silk can provide good employment for our children. Maybe silk is a way to make sure that the poor can sort of care for themselves and don't rely too much on community aid. So they're trying to manage all of these different demands on their time. And I think the fact that people constantly talk about silk as being pleasant and not taking up much time at all really is not helpful.
That's excellent. Because like, I honestly think we're still having those discussions, in the 21st century of like how women are juggling both working in the home as well as how working outside the home, and how that like labor is distributed. Seems like the same argument is repeating itself, and perhaps that's something we can all explore, but not here, right? So I think so. We're nearing up on the hour, so I'll conclude with the question about share with everyone your upcoming book publication, and give people so they can know how to be able to read more when you get that published.
I am so grateful that I actually set out with this talk to say you have to call it a book in progress, because for so long I was calling it a dissertation, and now we're in book manuscript stage. So unfortunately, I don't have a publication date for folks, but I did want to say that to sort of conjure it into being. It's like, now I better write that darn thing. So, but I will certainly keep the folks at the Utah State Historical Society posted about that process. But what I can say is that I have a journal article in the Journal of Women's History in the fall 2021 issue that is not about silk per se, but is about Mormon women and the railroad and consumer politics. And so that gives you sort of the political history of what I'm working on. But I have a few things in the hopper that will be available much more quickly. And then I hope one day we could all celebrate a book launch together. I mean, that's kind of surreal to think that I'm gonna, write this book, but I'm, fingers crossed. Just send me good energy, everybody. Okay.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we can, and I'll put, when I post the video of our chat today, I will put the citation for your article that you published, so that people can reference that as well. I will say in the last couple of minutes that we have, it's really interesting. I hadn't really thought that much about silk, but it reminded me, as you talked, it reminded me of a discussion I had with a colleague a few weeks ago. We were talking about Susie Young Gates and a photograph that I was trying to date, basically, and how I would put it in the record. And she's wearing a silk dress, and we think it's about like 1929, and it is like legit not, it doesn't look anything like 1920s, 1930s fashion. And she like stands out among everyone else, and we're like, why is she wearing that dress? Like everybody else is like wearing 20s stuff, and she's wearing something different. And now I have to know more about this dress, because is it like this representation of women's autonomy and like participation in this economic output, and really like help us to like, and as including the audience, like how do we look at our family photos and anything else, and like how does what people are wearing and what they have in their backgrounds, how does it represent this broader like ideological understanding of the way that women are participating and working in society in general, and in Utah and around the country. So what a fascinating topic. Yeah, what a fascinating topic. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for coming today, Sasha. It was I absolutely enjoyed this topic, and thinking about that. I definitely need to try the jam, because that is quite the topic in the questions. So y'all, I'm gonna give me some of that, because now everyone is talking about it. I'm gonna go for it. So even if we don't still have silk, we have the jam, and that is something to say.
Patsy, can I just shout out Luli Josephson in the chat? Luli, I'm so glad you were able to come. And of course, Luli, she knows one cocoon can generate a mile-long silk filament, and there's a lot of strands that need to be wound together or reeled in order to make silk thread. And Luli and I actually attempted to reel silk thread together, and that is a very fond memory I have. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today and celebrating Women's History Month with us to talk about women's silk production in Utah, and we hope you come for future 125th commemoration speaker series as we go on throughout the rest of this year.